So obviously the stance is incredibly important to your shot, but it can be very frustrating and very confusing trying to decipher all the information that's out there and actually finally find out which stance you should shoot with. So today I want to go through with you and actually show you the perfect archery stance. Now, before we get started, I want to run a quick vote here, and I want to see, let me know in the comments below, which stance you shoot with at the moment. Do you shoot the square stance, the open stance, or the closed stance? So let me know in the comments below for that, and then now we'll get started with the video. So first of all, we need to address the elephant in the room, and that is that there is not one stance that suits everyone. Frankly, to advise just one stance for every archer is naive at best, and it simply doesn't work because everyone is different and the way you shoot is going to be different, the setup of your bow is going to be different, and your technique is going to have its own unique nuances as well. So the myth that we need to bust first of all is that there is not one stance that suits everyone. Now, saying that, if you are a beginner, we do recommend that you start with the square stance. And this might not be the stance that you shoot with for your entire career, but it's a great starting point for some areas that we'll mention later on in this video. We would advise you to start with the square stance because it's simple, easy, and effective to begin with. And we'll mention more about that later on. Now, I want to go through the three main stances, and those are obviously the square, the open, and the closed stance. I want to show you the pros and the cons of each stance, and then I want to show you how you can pick which stance that you should shoot with for your shot. So first up is the square stance. Now obviously this involves the feet being equidistant across the shooting line, and the feet are in line with each other. So the left foot and the right foot are on the same line, they're not skewed backwards or forwards. So this is a square stance, and normally the feet would be shoulder width apart for this, and crucially the feet, the pelvis and hips and the shoulders are in line with each other. So this is the square stance. The pros of the square stance are that it can be a bit easier to achieve alignment with the square stance. It can be a bit easier to maintain your vertical T posture, so there's less temptation for you to shift forwards or backwards along the shooting line. So that is a benefit of the square stance. Also, the square stance pairs quite nicely with resting the bow on the foot. So if you take the bow from the foot and you rest the limb on the foot, then the square stance can work well with that. Because the square stance involves less rotation of the upper body and the torso, there's going to be less stress on the spine, and it can be a little bit less fatiguing and a little bit less energy required to get the same alignment of the shot. Now, the negatives of the square stance are basically that it can be less stable along the shooting line. Because your stance is effectively, your left and your right foot are in line, then you can sway a little bit more along the shooting line and be a bit less stable. So in a crosswind, the stance can be a bit less stable than an open stance, and also just generally, you might experience a bit more swaying and a bit more weight transfer with the square stance. So this is something to bear in mind and something you can work on as well. Also with the square stance, because there is a lot of the positioning of the alignment already done, it can be a little bit easy to become lazy and feel like you don't have to do much work with the square stance. But you still have to do the alignment, you still have to engage the core, and you still have to make sure that you're coming into full draw properly. So it's really key to make sure that you don't become lazy and you still go through the process that you need to do. So stance number 2 is the open stance, and the natural benefits of this stance are that it can be easier to connect the draw side of the shot, to connect the hook with the draw hand, with the draw arm and the elbow and through to the back. This can be easier because the normal positioning of the open stance with the bow and then also with the rest of the body can encourage this connection on the draw side. So that's a benefit of the stance. Also, in the wind, because of the extra torso rotation and the twisting, in the wind this stance can be more stable than the open stance and the closed stance, and also it can encourage and make sure that you always keep the core and keep this engaged rather than becoming lazy. Also, because of the actual physical act of rotating the torso, this can actually make alignment a bit more easy for some people because you're forcing the alignment with the whole body rather than just creating the alignment through the shoulders. So it can be a little bit more difficult for some people, but also for some people it can be a little bit more easy to consistently come into alignment. And this is something you would have to experiment with. So some compromises of the open stance. To start with, because of the extra rotation and the twisting of the torso and the abdomen, it can be a little bit more fatiguing and more stressful on the body, particularly the spine. So some people might experience some backache or back pain with the open stance that could be alleviated by using a square stance. This depends on the person, but because of the twisting of the body, this can actually happen, and it's something to look at on a case-by-case basis. So the open stance can make it a little bit harder to get the bow shoulder into line because of the starting position and because there's actually a lot more torso rotation you need to do. If you come up and you're unable to do the torso rotation properly, it will leave your bow shoulder further from the line that you need to be in. So the caveat obviously with the open stance is if you can do the torso rotation, you can get into good alignment. If you can't do it, you will be in a worse position than if you use the square stance. So that's one of the compromises there. Now, the closed stance generally involves a very similar stance to the square stance, but just moving the right foot, for a right-handed archer, moving the right foot slightly backwards, turning it slightly out. So it's almost a mirror image of the open stance, but to a much, much smaller degree. Now this stance can be useful if you're really struggling with the bow shoulder side particularly, and you don't particularly struggle with the draw side in terms of connecting the shot and getting into alignment. So if you have good alignment, but you're struggling to really get consistent shoulder positioning on the front side, and maybe on release there's a bit of an issue there, or maybe there's some pelvis movement on release and stuff like that, the closed stance can help with this. And this is on more of a case-by-case basis. Generally, the closed stance is a little bit more of a niche stance, and probably 80 to 90% of archers fall within the open and the square stance. The closed stance is a little bit more rare, but it doesn't mean that it's not applicable to you, and it's definitely something to look at. So why would you shoot with a square stance? As I mentioned, the square stance is good for beginners. It's good if you're struggling to get a little bit of alignment. It's good if you're struggling a little bit with the bow shoulder position. And it's good if you're struggling with the posture, the vertical posture, and you tend to lean towards or lean away from the target. The open stance, with the twisting of the body, can make it a little bit harder to feel where you are in terms of the posture. So this is a benefit of the square stance. Also, the square stance can be a great option for people who are not overly flexible in the upper body and torso. And this is also why it's great for beginners, because you need to develop that flexibility in the upper body and the shoulders over time. So if you're trying to force yourself to shoot with the open stance, but you're generally quite stiff in the upper body, then this could be an issue, and maybe a square stance can help you a little bit here because there is less rotation that's needed and it's a little bit more suited to that type of person who lacks a bit of the upper body flexibility. For the open stance, it is a great stance for people who have the flexibility to get into good alignment and really want to align the set position connection on the right side, the draw side, and really get that nailed. So if you maybe struggle with this and you use the square stance, but you struggle to get this draw side connection, then the open stance could help with this because of the positioning of the bow and because of the positioning of the shoulders in relation to the target. This can help with that. So it's something to look into for sure. Now, also with the open stance, it's generally more favorable towards people who rest the bow on the leg and also who have a heavier mass weight bow. The square stance is more suited to people who have a lower mass weight bow. And the reason for this is if you have an extremely heavy bow, when you then raise it off the foot, it's very hard to set the grip and the hook correctly at the set position because the mass of the bow is pulling the bow down and it can make it very hard to create your balance. If you're resting the bow on the leg at the set position, it can be a lot easier to use the open stance and set the grip and the hook and set your connection here with a heavy bow, because the bow is not being pulled down, and you can basically set your hands without having to physically hold the bow up. So that's another pro for the open stance, because it can be better for people who shoot a heavier mass weight setup. So the closed stance is a good option for someone who has a lot of the areas of the shot in a good position, in a good place, but just wants to get a little bit more stability, a little bit more power in the front shoulder, and you're not worried about compromising the draw side connection because you've got that and it's good and you can repeat it. So like I said before, it's a little bit more of a niche stance, and it will take a little bit more testing and finding out exactly how you can use this stance for you. But just bear in mind with the closed stance that you want to make sure that you have enough range of motion for you to open the bow properly and not, stop yourself drawing the bow in the correct way. If you start and you're very, very closed to the target already, your shoulders are very much in alignment, it can be then hard to open the bow and go anywhere because you've done most of the alignment already. So it's something to bear in mind with the closed stance, and it's a reason why you don't see it as often as the open and the square stance. A very, very general point here, and that is that extremely generally, the more open the stance is, the more it favors the draw side connection, and the more closed the stance is, the more it favors the bow side connection. So let me explain that a little bit. If you open your stance, you'll probably find it easier for you to connect the draw side of your shot, but then as you come up and get into alignment, it can make the bow side alignment harder and you have to do more work to get that alignment. On the reverse side, if you close the stance down, it can improve your ability to get the bow side alignment, but it can make the draw side connection harder to connect and engage and then keep through the shot. So it's something to bear in mind and something to use if you particularly know that my bow shoulder is good, but I need to improve the draw side of my shot, then it can be useful to slightly angle your stance and see if that helps the side of your shot as well. So that was an overview of the stance and how you find the right stance for you. I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, be sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. You can find us on social media and I'll put the links to those below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.